The afternoon sun was beating down on our Denver suburban backyard, casting long golden shadows across the freshly cut grass. The air was thick with the rich scent of hickory smoke, caramelized barbecue sauce, and the expensive craft beer Carter insisted on buying just to impress his coworkers. I was balancing a heavy wooden tray loaded with grilled vegetables and artisanal sliders, weaving my way through a crowd of 40 people. I had been on my feet since 6 in the morning, marinating meats, scrubbing the patio furniture, and stringing up fairy lights to make sure this end of summer party was absolutely flawless. Carter, meanwhile, had slept until noon, wandering downstairs only to complain that I had not ironed his favorite linen shirt. Carter was 33 years old, a software sales director who wore his title like a crown. He stood near the expensive stone fire pit I had built with my own 2 hands last spring, holding court with a group of his junior sales representatives. He was laughing loudly, tossing his head back, playing the role of the generous, wealthy host. He wore designer sunglasses that cost more than my first car, and he was completely in his element. I walked over to the patio table to set down the heavy tray, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. I smiled at our neighbors asking about their recent vacation, playing the role of the perfect supportive wife. That was when I heard the sharp metallic clink of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal wine glass. The sound cut through the ambient chatter and the soft jazz playing from the outdoor speakers. Carter was standing on the slightly elevated wooden deck holding his glass high in the air. A smug, self-satisfied grin was plastered across his face. "Gather around, everyone! Gather around!" Carter called out, his voice booming over the quiet murmurs of our guest. "I want to make a quick toast." The crowd naturally shifted toward the deck. Conversations halted. People turned with polite, expectant smiles. I stood near the edge of the patio, wiping my hands on my apron, assuming he was going to thank everyone for coming, or maybe brag about his latest quarterly commission check. He loved any excuse to command an audience. "As you all know, it has been an incredible year for me," Carter began, puffing his chest out. "My team crushed our sales quotas, and I have been working 80-hour weeks to provide this beautiful home, this incredible backyard, and this amazing lifestyle for my family." He gestured expansively around the yard, taking full credit for the space I had meticulously designed and maintained. I kept my smile perfectly pinned in place, accustomed to his need for public validation. "But success brings clarity," Carter continued, his tone shifting. The jovial, boastful energy drained away, replaced by something sharp and calculating. He looked directly at me, his eyes locking onto mine over the heads of our friends and neighbors. His smile did not reach his eyes. "And lately, I have realized that true partnerships require equal effort. They require two people pulling their own weight." A few uncomfortable shifts rippled through the crowd. The woman standing next to me lowered her drink. The atmosphere on the patio suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if the barometric pressure had dropped in an instant. "So I have an announcement to make," Carter said, his voice ringing out loud and clear in the dead silent yard. "Honey, starting this month, we will each manage our own money. We are splitting all finances 50-50 down the middle. I am sick of supporting you. I am completely done carrying a freeloader." The words hung in the air, echoing off the wooden fences and the brick exterior of our house. Freeloader. The silence that descended upon our backyard was absolute and suffocating. The soft jazz music from the speakers suddenly sounded painfully loud. No one moved. No one spoke. You could hear the faint sizzle of meat left too long on the grill and the distant chirp of a cicada. 40 guests stood completely frozen in a state of mortified shock. I saw the couple from next door exchange a wide-eyed, panicked look. A group of Carter's coworkers stared at the grass, suddenly finding their shoes incredibly fascinating. The sheer humiliation of the moment was designed to crush me. It was a calculated, deliberate public execution of my dignity. I looked at Carter. His body language was arrogant, dominant, and cruel. He stood with his feet planted wide, his shoulders squared, looking down at me from the elevated deck. He was waiting for my reaction. He was waiting for my face to crumble. He wanted me to burst into tears, drop the spatula, and run inside the house so he could turn to his friends and play the exhausted, reasonable husband dealing with an emotional, dependent wife. He wanted to force me into a submissive, embarrassed state, right in front of our peers, establishing his absolute financial and emotional supremacy. My name is Riley, and I am 29 years old. If you have ever had someone you love try to publicly humiliate you to feed their own fragile ego, you know exactly how cold the blood in your veins can run. If you have ever felt abandoned and betrayed by the person who was supposed to protect you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because you will definitely want to see what happened next. You will want to see the exact moment I smiled back at him and the glorious, chaotic downfall he brought upon himself when he realized he was the one who was actually drowning. I did not drop the spatula. I did not run inside. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single tear. Instead, I reached out and took a crystal wine glass from the tray of a stunned coworker standing frozen beside me. The crystal felt cool and heavy in my hand. I stepped forward, closing the distance between the patio edge and the wooden deck where my husband stood, waiting for my collapse. I raised the glass high, leveling my gaze directly into his eyes, matching his arrogant posture with absolute stillness. "I completely agree," I said. My voice was smooth, carrying easily across the silent yard. 50-50 from this moment forward, to equal partnerships. I took a slow sip of the wine. The collective sharp intake of breath from the guests was almost comical. I lowered my glass, smiled pleasantly at the crowd, and turned back to the grill as if we had just agreed on the weather. Carter faltered. The smug grin slipped from his face for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. He had prepared for a hysterical wife. He had prepared to play the victimized, exhausted provider calming down his irrational spouse. He had absolutely no script for calm, cheerful agreement. He blinked, shifting his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. But his ego was too large to let the moment hang. He forced a loud, booming laugh, attempting to wrap the cruel declaration in the guise of a bold financial strategy. "You heard her, folks," Carter announced, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence, "to equal partnerships." He quickly stepped down from the deck and ushered his coworkers toward the outdoor bar, loudly shifting the conversation to the upcoming golf tournament. The party resumed, but the atmosphere was irreparably fractured. The music played, the drinks poured, but the guests moved with a distinct, hurried tension. People could not look me in the eye. Neighbors suddenly remembered early morning commitments for the next day. Coworkers fabricated excuses about babysitters and long drives. Within an hour, the crowded patio had completely emptied, leaving behind a battlefield of half-eaten sliders, crumpled napkins, and empty bottles. Carter did not stay to help. The moment the last guest pulled out of the driveway, he announced he was exhausted from entertaining. He walked inside, tossed his designer sunglasses onto the kitchen counter, and went upstairs to sleep off the craft beer. I remained outside alone in the fading light. The string lights I had carefully hung just that morning clicked on, casting a warm glow over the messy patio. I began the methodical process of cleaning. I gathered the abandoned plates, scraping cold food into the trash bags. I stacked the crystal glasses. I scrubbed the grease from the grill with a wire brush. The repetitive physical labor gave me the space to let my mind drift backward to the reality my husband had so conveniently decided to erase. 6 years ago, there was no stone fire pit. There was no pristine suburban backyard. 6 years ago, we lived in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city. The heating barely worked and the windows rattled every time the wind blew. Carter had just been accepted into a prestigious business program. It was a rigorous, demanding track, and he convinced me that he needed to focus entirely on his studies to secure our future. Our future. That was the phrase he used to secure my complete devotion. To pay the rent, cover his tuition gaps, and keep the lights on, I took on everything. I worked a morning shift, opening a local coffee shop at 4 in the morning. I spent my afternoons working the floor at a retail clothing store. I spent my evenings hunched over a cheap, wobbly desk, doing freelance data entry, until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. My entire existence was a cycle of working, sleeping for 4 hours, and waking up to work again. Our luxury dinners consisted of instant ramen noodles, bulk bought from discount stores. I would add a cheap egg to his bowl to make sure he had protein for his study sessions, taking the plain noodles for myself. I wore shoes with holes in the soles because every spare dollar was funneled into his textbooks, his networking events, his professional wardrobe. I was his foundation. I was the stepping stone he stood on to reach the height he now occupied. Now Carter was pulling in $200,000 a year. He wore custom-tailored suits and drove cars he leased purely for the badge on the hood. The struggle was over, but the narrative had shifted entirely in his mind. The moment the massive commission check started rolling and his memory of our shared struggle evaporated. He convinced himself that his success was entirely self-made. He looked at me, still living modestly, still careful with expenses, and saw a burden. He saw a woman who lacked his aggressive ambition. He looked at the wife who had starved herself to feed his dreams and saw nothing but a freeloader slowing down his ascent to the top. I tied off the last trash bag with a sharp, tight knot. A cool evening breeze swept through the yard, rustling the leaves of the oak tree we had planted together 2 years ago. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt an incredible crystalline clarity. He wanted to measure my worth in dollars. He wanted to draw a hard line down the middle of our lives and separate his empire from my perceived poverty. I carried the heavy trash bags down the driveway to the curb, setting them down with a heavy thud. I looked back at the large, dark house. Carter was sleeping soundly upstairs, secure in the belief that he had just put me in my place. He truly believed he was stripping me of my comfort. He had no idea what I had been doing during the hours he spent playing golf and networking. He had no idea that drawing a hard financial line between us was the greatest gift he could have possibly given me. I locked the back door, turned off the patio lights, and walked quietly up the stairs to prepare for the new reality beginning tomorrow morning. I knew exactly what kind of game he was initiating, and I was entirely prepared to play by his new, ruthless rules. I woke up the next morning to the harsh, vibrating buzz of my phone on the nightstand. Carter was already gone, his side of the bed neatly made, completely devoid of the usual weekend laziness. I picked up my phone, squinting against the bright morning sunlight filtering through the blinds. The screen was plastered with a rapid-fire sequence of push notifications. They were not text messages from friends or alerts from my calendar. They were charge requests. Carter had downloaded an expense-splitting app overnight, and he was currently weaponizing it with militant precision. $3.42 for half a gallon of oat milk. $4.15 for my portion of the premium coffee beans he bought on his way home from the gym yesterday. He had clearly spent the morning going through our pantry, our bathrooms, and our utility bills, itemizing our shared existence down to the literal penny. There was a charge for exactly half of the monthly internet bill calculated to the day. Another notification popped up as I was staring at the screen, demanding $12 for my 50% share of the bulk toilet paper pack sitting in the hall closet. I walked downstairs, finding Carter sitting at the kitchen island, dressed in crisp golf attire, tapping away on his tablet with intense focus. He did not look up when I poured myself a cup of the aforementioned itemized coffee. He cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound meant to command the room and force my attention entirely onto him. He informed me that since we were operating as true financial equals, now we needed to treat our living arrangement like a formal business partnership. He slid a printed spreadsheet across the cool marble countertop. It was not just a list of groceries and internet bills. The spreadsheet detailed the current market rate for renting a 3-bedroom suburban house in our specific Denver neighborhood. He had pulled recent comparative listings, highlighting the inflated rental prices driven by current market trends. He tapped his expensive silver pen against the bottom line. The house, he reminded me with a slow, patronizing smile, was solely in his name. His name was on the deed, his name was on the mortgage, and his name was on the property tax bills. Therefore, as an equal partner sharing his asset, I was required to pay him exactly half of the current market rental value on the first of every single month. He even added a line item for landscaping maintenance, stating that, since I only managed the garden and not the professional lawn mowing service, I owed him a percentage of that fee as well. He leaned back in his leather bar stool, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for the explosion. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to point out that the market rent he was demanding was significantly higher than the actual mortgage payment, meaning I would essentially be paying his mortgage while he banked the equity and the profit. He expected me to cry to beg for a grace period to remind him of the 6 years I spent keeping a roof over our heads while he studied. He was craving a desperate pleading reaction to validate his newfound financial supremacy. Instead, I picked up the spreadsheet, scanned the meticulously typed columns, and nodded slowly. I told him his calculations seemed incredibly thorough and entirely fair based on his new rules. I set my coffee mug down, walked over to my small home office nook, and pulled a checkbook from my desk drawer. I returned to the kitchen island and began writing. I did not write one large convenient sum. I wrote a series of small, incredibly specific checks. One for the rent, one for the internet, one for the oat milk and the toilet paper. I wrote them with agonizing slowness, making sure my handwriting looked slightly shaky, portraying the exact image of a woman terrified of overdraft fees. I handed the stack of checks across the counter, letting my hand linger just long enough to convey a sense of deep manufactured hesitation. I watched him inspect the checks one by one. A triumphant, vicious gleam lit up his eyes. He saw a woman completely cornered, emptying her meager freelance design earnings just to survive in his house. He believed he had successfully trapped me in a financial vice, forcing me to either submit to his ultimate authority or pack my bags and leave with absolutely nothing. What he failed to realize was that writing those small checks was the easiest acting job of my entire life. Every single cent I handed over was coming from an old, nearly dormant personal checking account I kept entirely separate from my actual business finances. It was an account I used exclusively for petty cash and minor household expenses. To him, these checks represented my financial ruin. To me, it was the financial equivalent of couch change. I was buying my peace and maintaining my cover for less than the cost of a nice dinner out. He tucked the checks into his designer wallet, gave me a condescending pat on the shoulder, and told me he was glad we could handle this like mature adults. He grabbed his golf clubs and walked out the door, whistling a cheerful tune into the morning air. He thought he had won the war on the very first day. He thought he had successfully weaponized our marriage and put me firmly in my place. As his luxury car peeled out of the driveway, I simply washed my coffee mug, dried my hands, and prepared for the next phase of his game, knowing full well that his overbearing family would soon be joining the fray to try and make my life even more miserable. The peace of the morning shattered at exactly noon. The front door swung open without a single knock, hitting the interior wall with a dull, heavy thud. High heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing through the house. It was Vanessa Carter's 31-year-old sister. She treated our home like her personal country club lounge, and she consistently treated me like the hired help. Vanessa was the type of woman who wore designer clothes bought entirely on credit and rode the coattails of her brother's success as if his software commissions were a joint family inheritance. She dropped her oversized leather tote onto the kitchen island, carelessly knocking over the neat stack of mail I had just organized. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, she marched straight to the refrigerator and pulled out the exact carton of oat milk Carter had charged me for on his phone application just hours prior. She grabbed a glass, poured herself a generous amount, and took a long, exaggerated sip. Then she reached into the pantry and tore open a bag of artisanal sea salt chips I had purchased with my own money the day before. She left the pantry door wide open, letting crumbs drop onto the pristine marble floor with every bite she took. She leaned heavily against the counter, eyeing me up and down with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. So Vanessa began, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Carter tells me you two are finally acting like roommates. It is about time he stopped funding your little lifestyle." I continued, wiping down the counter, keeping my breathing perfectly even. "We decided on a financial arrangement that works for both of us, Vanessa," I replied mildly. She scoffed, tossing another chip into her mouth. "Please, We all know he is the one bringing in the real money. He just bought a whole new set of golf clubs this morning. He is out there making massive deals while you are stuck in here playing around with your little side hustle. Her characterization of my work was deliberately insulting. To Vanessa and Carter, my freelance graphic design was nothing more than a cute hobby meant to keep me busy while the real adults handled the serious money. She laughed a sharp, grating sound that filled the kitchen. I mean, how many logos do you have to draw just to pay for your half of the internet bill? It must be exhausting trying to keep up with someone in his tax bracket. I smiled politely, refusing to take the bait. I simply told her that hard work always pays off in the end. Carter returned home an hour later, his face flushed with the triumph of a good golf game. The moment he walked through the door, Vanessa practically sprinted to his side. She linked her arm through his, praising his new clubs and loudly admiring his success. Then she pulled him into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, but I could hear the hushed, frantic urgency of her whispers. She was telling him that a true 50-50 split meant severing every single financial tie immediately. She insisted that keeping our joint credit card open was a massive liability. She told him I would probably try to max it out of pure spite to drain his hard-earned resources. I saw Carter nod slowly from the hallway, his ego inflating with every word of her paranoia. I grabbed my reusable grocery bags and announced I was heading to the supermarket to pick up ingredients for the week. Carter smirked, his eyes darting to Vanessa. He told me to have fun and reminded me to use the joint card for the shared household items, promising we would reconcile the receipt on the application later. I knew exactly what he was doing. The supermarket was packed with weekend shoppers. I navigated the aisles methodically, filling my cart with fresh produce, lean proteins, and expensive household staples. I loaded the items onto the conveyor belt, chatting amiably with the cashier. When it was time to pay, I pulled out the joint credit card Carter and I had shared for 5 years. I slid it into the chip reader. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. Declined. The cashier frowned and asked me to try it again. I removed the card, wiped the chip on my shirt, and inserted it a second time. Declined. The line of customers behind me began to shift impatiently. The cashier gave me a sympathetic, pitying look, asking if I had another form of payment. This was the exact scenario Carter and Vanessa had orchestrated. They wanted me to stand here staring at a cart full of food I supposedly could not afford burning with the humiliation of a declined card. They wanted me to call him in a panic, begging him to unlock the account or transfer funds so I could escape the glaring eyes of the people waiting behind me. I did not panic. I reached deeper into my wallet and pulled out a sleek, heavy metal card. It was a private wealth business card issued under a corporate name completely detached from Carter. It was tied to an account holding more liquid cash than Carter had ever seen in his entire life. I tapped the metal card against the reader. It approved instantly. I took my receipt, folded it carefully, and slipped the metal card back into its hidden slot. The cashier handed me my bags, completely unaware that she had just witnessed a masterclass in financial self-defense. Driving home, I prepared my performance. If I walked through the door calm and collected, Carter would immediately suspect I had alternative resources. He needed to believe his trap had worked flawlessly. He needed to feel the absolute power of financial control to keep him blinded to the reality of my situation. I pulled into the driveway, grabbed the heavy bags, and forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I let my shoulders slump and practiced a look of absolute frantic distress. I pushed the front door open, letting it slam shut behind me. I dropped the grocery bags onto the kitchen floor with a loud thud, ensuring a few apples rolled out across the tile. Carter and Vanessa were sitting at the kitchen island drinking sparkling water. They both turned to look at me, their faces identical masks of smug anticipation. I let my voice tremble perfectly. The card was declined, I said, my voice pitching upward in manufactured panic. I was standing right there at the front of the line and the joint card was completely shut off. It was so embarrassing. The cashier was staring at me, and there were 10 people waiting behind me. Carter let out a long, theatrical sigh. He stood up, walking over to me with the false patience of a parent dealing with a toddler. "Oh, right," he said smoothly. I called the bank on my way home from the golf course. Since we are managing our own money now, the financial advisor recommended I close all joint lines of credit to protect my assets. I meant to tell you before you left, but it slipped my mind. Vanessa giggled softly into her glass of water. She did not even try to hide her amusement. Well, how did you pay for all this food? She asked, her eyes gleaming with malice. I had to put it on my emergency credit card, I lied, letting my voice crack just a little. The one with the terrible interest rate. I am going to have to take on 3 extra design commissions this week, just to pay it off before the billing cycle hits. Carter smiled a deep, satisfied expression that radiated absolute power. He patted my arm condescendingly. That is the reality of being financially independent, Riley. It is tough out there in the real world. You will figure it out. He turned back to Vanessa, completely dismissing my fake distress, his ego thoroughly fed. They had their victory. They had successfully humiliated the freeloader. But as I bent down to pick up the spilled apples, hiding my face from their view, I allowed myself a genuine, razor-sharp smile, knowing it was time to quietly secure the massive empire they had no idea I was running. I waited until the sound of Carter and Vanessa laughing in the living room faded into the background. I finished putting away the groceries, neatly organizing the organic produce and the expensive oat milk in the refrigerator. Once the kitchen was spotless, I retreated to my small desk tucked away in the corner of our guest bedroom. Carter always referred to this cramped space as my little craft corner. He genuinely believed I spent my days in here adjusting color palettes for local bakery menus and designing cheap flyers for dental clinics. He believed I was pulling in maybe $30,000 a year on a good run, just enough to cover my half of our modest expenses and occasionally treat myself to a new pair of shoes. He was completely wrong. I sat down in my high-end ergonomic chair, a product I had personally designed, and woke up my laptop. The screen illuminated my face. I bypassed the folders containing my fake freelance portfolio and logged directly into my secure corporate dashboard. The numbers loaded instantly across the screen. Gross monthly revenue, net profit margins, customer acquisition costs, inventory levels across 3 different fulfillment centers. I was not a struggling graphic designer. For the past 3 years, I had been operating as the sole founder and chief executive officer of Lumina Ergo, a direct-to-consumer brand specializing in premium biomechanically engineered office furniture. The idea had sparked right after Carter secured his first major director-level promotion. He had come home complaining about his back pain from sitting in cheap office chairs all day, demanding I massage his shoulders while he bragged about his new salary. I realized then that the massive shift toward remote and hybrid work had created a permanent gap in the market. People needed functional, aesthetically pleasing medical-grade office furniture that did not look like it belonged in a corporate cubicle. I started sketching prototypes the very next morning. I found a manufacturer, ordered samples, and launched a basic website using the tiny bit of savings I had managed to scrape together from my actual freelance design days. When the first few sales trickled in, I felt a rush of adrenaline. But I did not spend a single dime of that money. While Carter was busy inflating his lifestyle, upgrading his wardrobe, and making sure everyone at his country club knew exactly how much his quarterly bonuses were, I was quietly funneling every single penny of profit right back into my supply chain. I bought more inventory. I optimized my digital marketing campaigns. I hired a remote customer service team and outsourced my logistics. The business snowballed with terrifying speed. Within 18 months, Lumina Ergo was generating 7 figures in revenue. Yet I continued to pay myself an absolute minimum salary. I transferred just enough money into my personal checking account to cover my half of the household bills and keep up the facade of the struggling artist wife. It was the perfect cover. Carter possessed a fragile, monstrous ego. He desperately needed to be the undisputed breadwinner. He thrived on the power dynamic of being the wealthy provider, the man who graciously allowed his wife to pursue her cute little passions because he was successful enough to carry the household. If I had told him that my company was making 10 times his salary, his pride would have shattered. Worse, he would have instantly demanded access to the capital. He would have pressured me to pull money out of the business, to buy luxury watches, sports cars, and a massive mansion just to flex on his peers. I knew that revealing my success would mean handing over the keys to my hard work, so I guarded my secret fiercely. Just last month, the reality of what I had built crystallized into a staggering, undeniable number. An aggressive private equity firm specializing in e-commerce acquisitions had reached out to me. They spent weeks conducting a preliminary audit of my financials, my customer retention rates, and my proprietary designs. They presented me with an official term sheet for a complete buyout. The valuation they placed on my company was exactly $8 million. Exactly $8 million. I sat completely still and stared at the glowing dashboard, thinking about the absurd petty display I had just endured at the grocery store. Carter and Vanessa had conspired to publicly humiliate me over a cart full of food, believing I was entirely dependent on a joint credit card. They thought they had backed me into a corner of financial desperation. Meanwhile, my personal net worth was soaring higher than Carter could ever dream of achieving in his entire lifetime of software sales. I clicked over to my secure banking portal and initiated a transfer. I moved exactly $500 from my hidden corporate dividend account to the high-interest emergency credit card I had just used to buy their groceries. The balance cleared instantly, leaving no trace. The fabricated financial crisis was completely handled in less than 30 seconds. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The game Carter was playing was dangerous, but he was playing checkers while I was moving chess pieces on a board he did not even know existed. His 50-50 rule was designed to break me, but it was actually the ultimate shield. By demanding strict financial separation, he was willingly building a wall between his income and mine. However, I knew that his arrogance was unpredictable. As his spending increased and his desperation for status grew, he might eventually try to dig into my life. If he caught wind of the $8 million valuation, his 50-50 rule would vanish instantly. He would run to the nearest divorce lawyer and claim that since I built the business during our marriage, he was entitled to exactly half of my empire. I could not let that happen. The time for hiding behind a modest lifestyle was over. It was time to build a legal fortress around my assets. I picked up my phone and opened my encrypted messaging application. I desperately needed someone who truly understood complex corporate law, someone who despised Carter's relentless arrogance just as much as I did, and someone who absolutely knew exactly how to manipulate the legal system to protect a woman's wealth. I typed out a very quick, urgent message to set up a meeting for the following morning, knowing the next step required absolute legal precision. The discreet downtown coffee shop was tucked away in a converted brick warehouse district, far from the polished suburban cafes Carter preferred. I arrived 10 minutes early, sliding into a leather booth at the very back, shielded by a large frosted glass partition. The espresso machine hissed in the background, masking the low hum of private conversations. Exactly on time, the bell above the door chimed. Nia walked in immediately, commanding the space without saying a single word. At 30 years old, my sister-in-law was an absolute force of nature. An African-American corporate attorney with a mind like a steel trap. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit that screamed billable hours. She was married to my older brother Liam, and over the past few years she had become my most trusted confidant. Nia possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of United States asset protection laws and an absolute unabashed disdain for Carter's inflated ego. She slid into the booth across from me, placing her sleek leather briefcase on the wooden table. She ordered a black coffee, fixed me with a piercing gaze, and demanded to know why I had messaged her at 1 a.m. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my bag, pulled out the thick manila folder containing the private equity term sheet, and slid it across the table. Nia opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the first page, her expression completely neutral, the ultimate poker face of a seasoned litigator. She flipped to the second page, tracing the lines of financial projections with a manicured fingernail. When she reached the final page displaying the $8 million valuation, she stopped. She slowly closed the folder, folded her hands on top of it, and looked back at me. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. She whispered that I was officially her favorite relative. I chuckled, taking a sip of my tea, but quickly sobered as I explained the events of the previous 24 hours. I detailed the backyard barbecue ultimatum, the itemized grocery receipts on the expense splitting application, and the declined credit card humiliation at the supermarket. I told her that Carter had drawn a hard line in the sand, demanding a strict 50-50 financial split because he believed I was a parasitic burden holding him back from true wealth. Nia leaned back against the leather booth, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. She stated that Carter possessed a truly spectacular brand of arrogance. He was handing me the exact legal precedent I needed to wall him off from my assets, completely unaware that he was locking himself out of a fortune. However, Nia quickly shifted into lawyer mode, her tone becoming urgent and precise. She warned me that Colorado marital property laws could still pose a massive threat. If Carter ever discovered the true value of Lumina Ergo, his pride would vanish instantly. He would hire aggressive counsel, argue that the business was built during the marriage, and demand exactly half of the $8 million. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told her that was exactly why I called her. I needed to build an impenetrable fortress around my company before Carter's reckless greed accidentally collided with my reality. Nia unlatched her briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad. She explained that we needed to execute a multi-tiered asset protection strategy. First, we were going to restructure the ownership of Lumina Ergo. The business could no longer be tied directly to my personal social security number. Nia outlined the process of establishing an anonymous limited liability company in Wyoming, a state renowned for its aggressive corporate veil protections and absolute privacy laws. This new entity would legally acquire the assets and intellectual property of my e-commerce brand. She did not stop there. To ensure Carter could never pierce the corporate veil, Nia proposed layering the ownership structure further. The Wyoming company would be owned by an irrevocable offshore trust legally domiciled in a jurisdiction strictly outside the reach of standard domestic family court subpoenas. Nia explained the mechanics with rapid-fire precision. Because Carter had publicly and formally demanded a complete separation of finances, we could legally document his intentional financial abandonment. He was actively refusing to contribute to any of my business ventures or share in my financial liabilities. Nia would draft an internal memorandum documenting his 50-50 mandate, creating a paper trail demonstrating that he had explicitly waived any interest in my professional endeavors. I listened intently, absorbing every legal maneuver. Nia assured me that this structure was completely bulletproof. Even if a private investigator somehow connected my name to the Wyoming entity, the offshore trust would act as a massive, expensive legal firewall. Carter would have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in international legal fees just to file a discovery motion, money he absolutely did not have. Nia pushed the legal pad toward me, tapping her pen against a flowchart she had drawn. She told me the restructuring would take about 2 weeks to finalize, but she needed my authorization to begin immediately. She warned me that during this transition period, I had to play my part flawlessly. I had to continue acting like a desperate, struggling freelancer. I had to let Carter feel big, let him brag, and let him think he was winning the financial war. Any sudden change in my behavior could trigger his suspicion before the offshore trust was fully operational. I took the pen and signed my name on the authorization forms she provided. The ink on the paper felt like a declaration of absolute independence. I promised Nia that Carter would not suspect a single thing. He was too consumed with his own manufactured success to ever look closely at my life. He was too busy looking down on me to ever see what was actually growing right beneath his feet. Nia packed the signed documents back into her briefcase, snapping the latches shut with a definitive click. She finished her coffee, gave me a fierce, supportive nod, and told me to keep my head down and my checkbook ready for whatever petty expense Carter tried to split next. We parted ways on the busy downtown sidewalk, the cool city breeze lifting my spirits. I walked toward my car, feeling lighter than I had in years. My financial empire was officially secure. I had successfully insulated my future from my husband's relentless narcissism. All I had to do now was sit back and watch Carter continue to inflate his own fragile ego, completely unaware that his reckless debt-fueled lifestyle was about to take a spectacular, disastrous turn. 2 weeks after my meeting with Nia, the offshore corporate restructuring was finalized precisely as planned. I received the encrypted confirmation email on a Tuesday morning while watering the hydrangeas in the front yard. My $8 million empire was now entirely invisible, locked behind a fortress of Wyoming privacy statutes and international legal barriers. I deleted the email, smiled at the blooming flowers, and walked back inside to prepare for my next performance. I did not have to wait long for Carter to provide the stage. That Friday afternoon, the unmistakable aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet tranquility of our suburban street. The sound reverberated off the neighboring houses, culminating in a screeching halt directly outside our front window. I set down my laptop and walked to the glass. There, gleaming aggressively in the driveway, sat a brand-new shark blue Porsche 911. Carter stepped out of the driver's side door wearing a tailored suit jacket with no tie and a pair of aviator sunglasses. He did not just park the car. He had deliberately angled the vehicle diagonally across the concrete, ensuring that its sleek rear bumper completely blocked in my 10-year-old silver Honda Civic. The message was not subtle. It was a physical manifestation of his perceived superiority. He had essentially trapped my modest, reliable vehicle behind his loud, ostentatious symbol of wealth. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Carter was leaning against the hood of the Porsche, gently polishing an invisible smudge with his expensive silk pocket square. He looked up, puffing his chest out as I approached. He announced that his quarterly software sales bonus had hit his bank account that morning. According to him, he had absolutely crushed his targets, outselling every other director in the region. He claimed the dealership practically begged him to take the car off their hands because he was exactly the kind of elite clientele they wanted driving their flagship models. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, offering a polite nod. I told him it was a very bright car. Carter scoffed at my lack of enthusiastic worship. He patted the gleaming hood and informed me that true success requires visual representation. He said men at his level could not be seen driving practical sedans anymore. It was all about projecting power. I glanced at my trapped Honda Civic, then back to the Porsche. I jingled my car keys in my hand. I told him I needed to run to the hardware store to pick up some potting soil for the garden and asked if he could pull his new car forward so I could back out of the garage. Carter let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed across the driveway. He crossed his arms and stared down at me. He flatly refused. He said he had just perfectly positioned the vehicle so the afternoon sun would hit the metallic paint at the optimal angle, and he was not about to ruin the aesthetic just so I could go buy dirt. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a condescending drawl. He suggested I just walk to the store or maybe take a bus. He actually laughed and told me that with the way I was scraping together my half of the household bills lately, I probably could not afford the gas to start the Honda anyway. He patted me on the shoulder, turned on his heel and strode confidently into the house, leaving me standing alone on the concrete. He expected me to be furious. He expected me to march inside, demand respect, and fight about driveway space. He wanted the conflict, because winning that argument would validate his dominance. I did not follow him. I did not raise my voice. I simply put my car keys back into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and ordered a premium Uber Black. A few minutes later, a pristine black SUV pulled up to the curb. I climbed into the leather interior, greeted the driver, and settled back into the plush seat. As we drove away from the house, I looked out the tinted window at the blue Porsche baking in the driveway. I did not feel a single ounce of humiliation or anger. I felt a profound, almost clinical sense of pity for the man I had married. Carter was completely financially illiterate. He operated on the delusion that spending money equated to having money. That Porsche was not an asset. It was a massive, depreciating liability. I knew the exact structure of his commission payouts. That quarterly bonus likely covered the hefty down payment and the astronomical luxury vehicle taxes, but he had definitely financed the rest. He had just shackled himself to a crippling monthly car payment, exorbitant insurance premiums, and maintenance costs that would bleed his monthly cash flow dry. He was buying depreciating metal to impress neighbors who did not care and coworkers who were secretly hoping he would fail. He was funding a fragile illusion of wealth with aggressive high-interest debt. Meanwhile, my hidden reality was the exact opposite. My e-commerce company generated actual sustained cash flow. Every dollar of profit I made was strategically reinvested into supply chain optimization, aggressive customer acquisition, and product development. My 10-year-old Honda Civic was fully paid off. It cost me nothing but basic insurance and regular oil changes. It served its purpose perfectly, transporting me from point A to point B without draining my capital. I did not need to project power because I actually possessed it. I sat in the back of the quiet Uber pulling up my secure corporate dashboard on my phone. The numbers updated in real time. While Carter was busy admiring his reflection in the hood of a car the bank actually owned, Lumina Ergo had just processed another $60,000 in daily sales. The contrast between his debt-fueled vanity and my silent compounding wealth was staggering. Carter believed his new car made him untouchable. He believed he was climbing into the upper echelons of the financial elite. I knew differently. His desperate need to project a millionaire lifestyle was pushing him further and further to the edge of a very steep cliff. He was becoming reckless, addicted to the adrenaline of large transactions and the superficial respect they commanded. I closed the dashboard application and put my phone away as the Uber pulled into the hardware store parking lot. Carter had shown me exactly how vulnerable he was. His ego was a massive blind spot, and his appetite for financial risk was growing out of control. All I had to do was continue paying my half of the internet bill, keep my Honda Civic parked in the garage, and wait for him to make the inevitable catastrophic gamble that would bring his entire house of cards crashing down. The weeks following the arrival of the blue Porsche marked a distinct shift in Carter's behavior. The sports car provided a temporary high of superiority, but his fragile ego demanded a much larger stage. He began spending his weekends at an exclusive country club, desperate to infiltrate a higher social stratum. He started mingling with private equity directors and seasoned property developers, men who played with tens of millions of dollars before breakfast. Carter desperately wanted a seat at their elite table. He came home late on Thursday evenings, smelling of expensive scotch and loudly dropping industry buzzwords he had barely learned. He talked endlessly about capitalization rates, positioning himself as a financial visionary. These veteran investors recognized his desperation for status instantly and dangled the ultimate bait right in front of him. It was an exclusive high-risk commercial real estate syndicate. The project involved acquiring and redeveloping a massive distressed retail complex downtown. The buy-in was astronomical, far beyond what Carter actually had in liquid cash. Carter was completely blinded by greed and the intoxicating promise of exponential returns. He convinced himself this was the singular deal that would catapult him into the multimillionaire bracket. To secure his spot, he went all in. He did exactly what I had silently predicted. He over-leveraged every single asset attached to his name. Because he insisted on keeping the house solely under his ownership to assert his dominance over me, he faced no hurdles at the bank. He quietly pulled out a massive second mortgage on our suburban home, stripping away every ounce of equity we had built over the years. That cash injection was still not enough. Driven by absolute manic ambition, Carter turned to his stock portfolio. He contacted his brokerage firm and borrowed heavily on margin using his retirement investments as collateral for a massive high-interest cash loan. He was effectively betting his entire financial existence on a highly volatile commercial property market, showing microscopic fractures. He strapped himself to a mountain of unforgiving debt, convinced the syndicate payout would easily cover the carrying costs and leave him obscenely wealthy. I discovered the full extent of his gamble on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the living room sofa curled up with my laptop pretending to edit a menu for a freelance client. Carter burst through the front door, his energy vibrating at a frantic frequency. He immediately began pacing the length of the hardwood floor. He had his phone pressed tightly to his ear, intentionally setting the volume to maximum so I would be forced to hear every single word. He was talking to the lead partner of the real estate syndicate. His voice was booming, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. He bragged loudly about the massive wire transfer he had just authorized. He threw around terms like liquid capital and risk tolerance, practically shouting to ensure I understood the sheer magnitude of the money he was moving. He told the partner he was ready to become a major player in the commercial space and boasted about the imminent returns they were going to generate, performing a theatrical display of immense financial power. When the call finally ended, he shoved his phone into his pocket and turned to face me. He stood in the center of the living room, looking down at me with an expression of pure contempt mixed with triumphant glee. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the sofa, declaring that the deal he just finalized was going to change his life forever. He stated that within 12 months, the retail complex would be flipped and his investment would easily triple. He looked at my laptop, a vicious smirk spreading across his features. Then he issued his ultimate reminder. He pointed his finger directly at me and explicitly stated that because of our 50-50 financial arrangement, I would not see a single dime of his upcoming windfall. He said that while he was cashing multi-million-dollar dividend checks and upgrading his lifestyle to the elite tier, I would still be sitting on this exact couch drawing cheap logos to pay for my half of the electric bill. He wanted to make it absolutely clear that my poverty was permanent, and his wealth was strictly walled off from me. I kept my hands resting calmly on my keyboard. I looked up at his flushed, arrogant face. I did not blink or argue. I simply offered him a soft, compliant smile and told him I completely understood the boundaries he had set. I said I was happy he found an investment that suited his ambitions. He let out a short mocking laugh, shook his head at my perceived pathetic resignation, and walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a celebratory drink. He thought he had just locked me out of paradise, completely unaware he had just willingly locked himself inside a burning building. I turned my eyes back to my screen, pulling up the hidden financial news ticker I monitored daily. The macroeconomic environment was shifting rapidly. Inflation was running hot, and whispers of aggressive interest rate hikes were circulating. Commercial real estate relied entirely on cheap, accessible debt. If rates spiked, the carrying costs of that retail complex would skyrocket. Refinancing would become impossible, and the syndicate would hemorrhage cash. A rate hike would also trigger a massive stock market contraction. The stocks Carter used as collateral for his margin loan would plummet. By aggressively enforcing his 50-50 rule and declaring his investments were his alone, he had unknowingly shielded me entirely from the radioactive blast radius of his impending financial ruin. I sat quietly listening to the clink of ice in his empty glass. His arrogance had sealed his fate, and all I had to do was wait for the market to deliver the brutal reality check he desperately deserved. The clink of ice in Carter's glass was the sound of a man celebrating a victory he had not yet won. The following week, however, that celebratory confidence began to sour into a creeping, toxic paranoia. Carter had spent his entire weekend at the country club surrounded by older, cynical men who had already navigated messy, extremely expensive divorces. Those veteran investors planted a terrifying seed in his mind. They reminded him that Colorado marital laws could be incredibly unforgiving to the primary breadwinner. His newfound syndicate peers likely warned him that without an airtight legal barrier, a judge could easily award his supposedly dependent wife a massive portion of his impending commercial real estate payout. The mere thought of me getting a single cent of his imaginary millions drove him absolutely frantic. His behavior shifted drastically. The smug satisfaction of his margin loan gamble was replaced by an aggressive, restless anxiety. He started locking himself in his home office the second he returned from work. Through the thin drywall, I could hear him pacing frantically, having hushed intense phone calls with a high-priced family law attorney downtown. He was demanding airtight clauses, expedited drafting, and absolute legal certainty. He wanted to weaponize the legal system against me, just as he had weaponized our grocery bills on his phone application. He was desperate to build an impenetrable wall around his future wealth before the real estate syndicate paid out. The inevitable confrontation happened on a Thursday night. I was sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing a mock-up design for a fake freelance client, keeping my cover story perfectly intact. Carter marched into the room with heavy, determined steps. He carried a thick stack of crisp, watermarked legal paper bound in a premium blue folder. He slammed the document onto the marble countertop, right over my sketches, the sharp slap of paper echoing in the quiet kitchen. The bold black letters across the top page read, "Post-nuptial agreement." He stood over me, his posture rigid, dominant, and deeply hostile. He did not ask for a conversation. He issued a decree. Carter laid out the terms with malicious glee, his eyes wide with a manic need for control. He told me his aggressive lawyer had drafted a completely impenetrable contract that superseded any standard marital property laws. From the moment the ink dried on that paper, any business's debts, assets, and future windfalls generated by either party would belong entirely to that individual. There would be absolutely no asset division under any circumstances. There would be no spousal support, no alimony, and no financial safety net. If we ever divorced, we would each walk away with exactly what was in our individual bank accounts and nothing else. He pointed a sharp finger at the signature line, stating that this was the natural, necessary evolution of our 50-50 financial split. He wanted to make sure my hands were legally tied, ensuring I would be permanently unable to ever reach into his pockets when the commercial retail complex sold and made him a multimillionaire. He framed the document not as a mutual agreement, but as an eviction notice for my financial security. He paced around the kitchen island, bragging about the exorbitant retainer he paid the lawyer to ensure the contract was completely unbreakable. He wanted me to feel utterly powerless against his legal maneuver. I looked at the intimidating stack of paper, keeping my face perfectly blank. I slowly closed my laptop and asked him what would happen if I wanted to have my own lawyer review the document first. I suggested that a contract of this magnitude required at least a few days of careful consideration. Carter's face darkened instantly. The vein in his neck throbbed as his superficial charm vanished, revealing the core of his controlling nature. He leaned heavily over the counter, invading my personal space, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register. He told me there would be no negotiation, no independent review, and absolutely no delay. He delivered a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. He explicitly stated that if I refused to sign the document exactly as it was written, he would pack my bags himself and kick me out of the house that very night. He reminded me, his voice dripping with venom, that the deed to the suburban house was solely in his name. He threatened to have the locks changed before I even reached the end of the driveway. He told me I would be sleeping on the streets with nothing but my cheap design portfolio if I defied him. He wanted to terrify me with the prospect of instant homelessness, using the threat of physical displacement to force my financial surrender. He loomed over me, demanding my total submission to his legal trap, entirely convinced he was sealing my fate as a penniless dependent for the rest of my life. I stared up at him, letting a carefully constructed look of vulnerability wash over my features. Inside, my mind was racing with the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. He was threatening to destroy my life if I did not sign the exact document that would permanently shield my $8 million e-commerce empire from his grasp. He believed his brutal ultimatum was the ultimate power move, a masterstroke of financial defense designed to protect his highly leveraged debt-fueled real estate gamble. He thought he was locking me in the poorhouse. He had no idea that his intense paranoia and ruthless greed had just provided me with the greatest legal gift I could have ever asked for. The trap was fully set, but he was the one standing right in the center of it, holding out the lock and key. I stared up at his flushed, furious face and let a perfectly calibrated tremor enter my voice. I asked him for just 12 hours. I pleaded with him, letting my eyes well up with manufactured panic, begging him to at least let me sleep on it so I could process the gravity of what he was demanding. Carter scoffed, practically vibrating with the thrill of his own authority. He slammed his fist on the marble counter and declared I had until exactly noon the following day. If my signature was not on his desk by the time he came home for his lunch break, my belongings would be thrown onto the front lawn. He turned and stormed up the stairs, leaving the thick blue folder sitting on the island like a loaded weapon. The absolute second I heard our bedroom door slam shut, I grabbed the folder, slipped on my coat, and walked straight out the back door. The night air was biting, but I barely felt the cold. I drove directly to the downtown high-rise where my brother Liam and his wife Nia lived. I had texted Nia from my driveway, and she was already waiting in her luxurious living room with 2 glasses of expensive scotch poured. I tossed the blue folder onto her glass coffee table and sank into the velvet armchair opposite her. Nia opened the document. The room was perfectly silent, except for the crisp sound of pages turning. I watched her sharp eyes dart back and forth across the dense legal paragraphs. She read through the indemnification clauses, the strict separation of asset addendums, and the explicit waivers of future wealth generation. For a tense 5 minutes, neither of us spoke. Then a low rumble started deep in Nia's chest. It bubbled up her throat and erupted into a full echoing laugh that filled the entire apartment. She tossed the contract back onto the table and wiped a genuine tear of pure amusement from her eye. Nia looked at me and declared that Carter had just paid a premium downtown law firm thousands of dollars to legally assassinate his own financial future. She pointed to a specific paragraph buried on page 7. It explicitly stated that neither party would have any legal standing, equitable interest, or claim of marital right to any corporate entities, intellectual property, or future liquidity events created by the other party, retroactive to the date of their marriage and extending into perpetuity. Nia explained that Carter was so blinded by his obsession to protect his highly leveraged commercial real estate gamble that he had drafted a universal, impenetrable shield around my $8 million e-commerce business. He had effectively locked the vault from the outside and handed the only key directly to me. Nia leaned forward, her expression shifting from deep amusement to absolute seriousness. She told me the document was a masterpiece of asset protection, but it contained one fatal flaw. It was completely dependent on my willingness to sign it without demanding financial disclosure. If Carter suspected for even a fraction of a second that I actually wanted this agreement, his intense paranoia would immediately kick in. He would demand a full audit of my bank accounts. He would hire forensic accountants. The entire illusion would collapse before the ink could even dry. Nia tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line. She told me I had to go back to that house and put on the performance of a lifetime. I needed to fight him. I needed to make him believe he was forcing me into financial exile. I had to let him taste the absolute tyrannical victory he was so desperately craving. I drove back to the suburbs the next morning, rehearsing my lines and calibrating my emotions with cold precision. I parked my reliable 10-year-old Honda Civic next to the glaringly empty spot where his blue Porsche usually sat. When I walked through the front door, Carter was standing in the living room dressed in a sharp custom suit, checking his expensive watch. The blue folder was resting on the coffee table right next to a heavy silver pen. I stopped in the doorway, letting my shoulders drop and my posture shrink. I forced a deep, shuddering breath, summoning real tears to the corners of my eyes. I walked slowly into the room, wrapping my arms around myself as if I were freezing. I looked at the folder, then up at him, letting my voice crack with carefully constructed despair. I begged him not to do this. I told him we were supposed to be a team, a true partnership. I reminded him of the years I spent working 3 exhausting jobs to put him through his business degree, asking him how he could discard my sacrifices so easily when he finally found success. Carter reveled in it. The sight of my tears acted like a narcotic for his massive ego. He puffed out his chest, completely energized by my perceived misery. He stepped closer, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He coldly informed me that the past was completely irrelevant. He stated that the business world operated on current value, and currently, I was bringing absolutely nothing to the table. He told me he was tired of carrying a dead weight, while he was on the verge of monumental generational wealth. He picked up the silver pen and forcefully shoved it into my trembling hand. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. He repeated his ultimatum with vicious clarity. He told me to sign the paper immediately or go upstairs, pack a single suitcase, and walk out the front door forever. He wanted to break my spirit entirely. He wanted me to feel utterly worthless, dependent, and trapped under his absolute authority. I let a fat, dramatic tear roll down my cheek. I looked at the pen in my hand, then at the harsh, unyielding face of the man I had once loved. I let out a defeated, broken sob. I leaned over the coffee table, my hand shaking violently. I pressed the pen to the heavy watermarked paper. I signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. I made sure my signature looked jagged and hesitant, the physical manifestation of a woman signing away her entire future under extreme duress. Carter snatched the folder from the table the absolute second the pen lifted from the page. He inspected the signature, a massive, victorious smile stretching across his face. He let out a loud, triumphant exhale. He told me it was the smartest decision I had ever made, casually tucking the legally binding document into his leather briefcase. He adjusted his silk tie, told me he had a very important meeting to celebrate his upcoming real estate fortune, and strutted out the front door without looking back. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, my posture instantly straightened. The tears stopped. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I stood alone in the quiet living room, listening to the roar of his car engine fading down the street. I felt a surge of pure electric triumph rush through my veins. He thought he had just condemned me to a life of financial servitude. He believed he had successfully protected his imaginary real estate fortune from his parasitic wife. He had absolutely no idea that he had just legally and permanently barricaded himself away from a thriving $8 million empire. The ink was dry. The trap was sprung. My future was entirely secure, and I was now completely free to sit back and watch him sprint blindly toward his own catastrophic financial ruin. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut before the suffocating weight of Carter's presence vanished from the house entirely. I stood in the center of the living room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence. He genuinely thought he had won. He was currently speeding down the highway, intoxicated by his own manufactured brilliance, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed away his only lifeline. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and smiled. My empire was safe. Now it was time to let him enjoy his delusion. Carter did not just celebrate his perceived victory, he weaponized it. 2 days after securing the post-nuptial agreement, he burst through the front door holding 2 thick, glossy travel brochures. He had just received the preliminary paperwork for his commercial real estate syndicate, and though the deal had not actually closed or paid out a single cent of real profit, his mind was already living in a reality where he was a certified multimillionaire. He announced with the theatrical flair of a monarch granting a decree that he was taking a well-deserved victory lap. He was flying to Dubai for 2 weeks, and he was not taking me. Instead, he was taking Vanessa. His sister had practically wept with joy when he offered her the spare first-class ticket. Carter stood in the hallway packing a brand new set of designer luggage he had purchased on credit that very morning. He looked at me over his shoulder, his lips curled into that familiar, condescending smirk. He told me that Dubai was a playground for real players, a place where people of his caliber went to network and unwind. He adjusted his expensive watch and casually suggested that I stay home, keep the house clean, and keep working on my little projects. He said someone had to pay the internet bill while he was gone. I nodded meekly, offering a perfectly passive smile. I told him to have a wonderful trip and to be safe. I watched from the window as the airport transport service loaded his bags. Vanessa was already sitting in the back seat holding a glass of champagne, looking at my house with an expression of absolute triumph. They drove away, leaving me exactly where I wanted to be, completely alone and entirely unsupervised. The moment their flight crossed the Atlantic, the spectacular financial hemorrhage began. I could see the digital alerts from the few joint accounts we still nominally shared before the split, though he was primarily burning through his personal high-limit credit cards. Carter and Vanessa descended upon the United Arab Emirates like a pair of starved locusts. They were not just vacationing, they were actively trying to purchase a personality. Carter rented a private yacht for 3 days just to post photos on his social media accounts, ensuring all his coworkers back in Denver saw him living the elite lifestyle. Vanessa dragged him through every luxury boutique in the Dubai Mall, swiping his cards for designer bags, diamond watches, and bespoke silk dresses. They dined at restaurants where a single steak cost more than my monthly car insurance. They booked private helicopter tours and reserved VIP tables at exclusive beach clubs. Every single swipe of the card was fueled by the dangerous margin loan he had taken against his stock portfolio and the second mortgage on our suburban home. He was financing an illusion of extreme wealth with toxic radioactive debt, absolutely certain that his real estate payout would cover the reckless damage. While Carter and Vanessa were busy burning through imaginary money in the desert heat, I went to work. The silence of the empty house was the perfect environment for absolute focus. Lumina Ergo was growing at a pace that was beginning to strain my current logistics network. The demand for my premium ergonomic office furniture was skyrocketing, and I needed to aggressively scale my operations to capture the market share before competitors caught up. I transformed the dining room table into a command center. I spent my days on intense high-stakes video calls with manufacturing partners across the globe. I negotiated raw material costs, streamlined production timelines, and completely overhauled my quality control protocols. I was not playing around with little projects. I was acting as the chief executive officer of an $8 million brand, making ruthless, calculated decisions to protect my profit margins. By the second week of Carter's lavish vacation, my hard work culminated in a massive breakthrough. A major national commercial distributor had taken notice of Lumina Ergo's rising market dominance. They wanted exclusive rights to supply my ergonomic chairs to corporate campuses across the entire Western Seaboard. The negotiations were intense. Their corporate lawyers tried to leverage my status as a solo female founder, attempting to squeeze my margins and dictate unfavorable terms. They severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I utilized every ounce of strategic knowledge I had gained from years of watching arrogant men like Carter operate. I countered their aggressive tactics with cold, hard data. I presented my customer retention rates, my proprietary biomechanical design patents, and my flawless supply chain metrics. I refused to budge on my pricing structure. After 4 grueling days of back and forth, they finally folded. I sat at my desk in the guest bedroom staring at the digital contract glowing on my screen. It was a 7-figure distribution deal. It guaranteed a massive sustained influx of cash flow for the next 3 years, effectively doubling the valuation of my company. I typed my signature onto the document and hit send. There was no champagne. There were no rented yachts or designer shopping sprees. There was only the quiet, profound satisfaction of generating real, tangible wealth through intelligence and relentless execution. I closed my laptop and walked into the kitchen to pour a simple glass of water. I looked out the window at the empty driveway. In just a few days, Carter and Vanessa would return from their desert fantasy. They would strut through the front door weighed down by shopping bags and inflated egos, ready to resume their campaign of domestic terror and financial superiority. Carter would undoubtedly parade his new luxury items in front of me, eager to remind me of my place at the bottom of his 50-50 hierarchy. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to crack. He was entirely blind to the macroeconomic storm brewing on the horizon, a storm that was about to collide violently with his hyper-leveraged, debt-ridden reality. I took a slow sip of my water, feeling a deep, vibrating sense of calm. My fortress was built. My assets were secured. I was perfectly positioned to sit back and watch the spectacular, devastating collapse of a man who had traded his entire future for the fleeting illusion of being the smartest person in the room. The front door flew open on a Sunday afternoon, slamming against the interior wall with the exact same obnoxious force Carter always used to announce his presence. He and Vanessa marched into the foyer, struggling under the weight of oversized, glossy shopping bags from every high-end boutique in the Emirates. Carter dropped a massive leather duffel bag onto the hardwood floor and immediately complained about jet lag, though his face was flushed with the manic, jittery energy of a man who firmly believed he had just conquered the globe. He tossed a small cheap plastic keychain onto the kitchen counter, claiming he had picked it up at the airport for me so I would not feel entirely left out of his luxurious lifestyle. I thanked him with a perfectly practiced meek smile, quietly marveling at his absolute lack of self-awareness. He did not even bother to unpack his bags before declaring that we were going out for a celebratory family dinner. He had secured a last-minute reservation at the most exclusive, ridiculously overpriced steakhouse in downtown Denver. He wanted to parade his new custom-tailored Dubai suits and flash his heavy diamond watch. He explicitly ordered me to wear something presentable so I would not embarrass him in front of the waitstaff, casually adding that he supposed he would have to cover my meal tonight since my struggling graphics business obviously could not afford a dry-aged ribeye. The restaurant was a cavernous, intimidating space of dark mahogany, dim amber lighting, and plush leather booths. Carter ordered for the table without asking what anyone wanted to eat. He demanded the most expensive seafood tower on the menu, 2 massive tomahawk steaks, and a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than a standard month of groceries. He spoke at a booming volume, ensuring the tables next to us could hear every single syllable. He bragged incessantly about his commercial real estate syndicate. He claimed the closing was just days away, boasting about the massive financial leverage he had utilized and how the incoming payout was going to instantly catapult him into the ultra-wealthy elite. He was practically vibrating with arrogance, totally blind to the fact that he was publicly bragging about burying himself in high-interest radioactive debt. When the waiter poured the expensive wine, Carter raised his glass and looked directly at me. He loudly lamented the heavy burden of his 50-50 financial rule, sighing dramatically as he stated that sometimes a highly successful man just has to carry the dead weight for an evening to keep up social appearances. He joked to the waiter that he was doing his charitable deed for the month by feeding his dependent wife. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water, keeping my posture entirely relaxed and my expression perfectly serene. I cut a small piece of my steak, chewing it thoughtfully, completely refusing to give him the defensive, humiliated reaction he was so desperately trying to provoke. Vanessa sat across the table from me, dripping in the heavy gold jewelry her brother had just financed on his maxed-out credit cards. She swirled her dark wine and leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with undisguised malice. She told Carter that with his new impending millionaire status, he really needed to start thinking about his personal brand and public image. She glanced at my simple, understated dress and openly suggested that it was time for him to upgrade to a wife who actually matched his new elite tax bracket. She stated that a man of his high caliber needed a partner who brought real tangible assets to the table, not a struggling artist who had to be subsidized just to sit in a luxury restaurant. Carter laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the mahogany walls and drew irritated glances from nearby diners. He patted his sister's hand and agreed, saying that he was definitely reevaluating all of his investments, including the domestic ones. He wanted to break my spirit right there over the white tablecloth. He wanted me to shrink into the leather booth, lower my eyes, and beg for my place in his suddenly glamorous life. Instead, I carefully placed my fork and knife down on my plate, dabbed the corner of my mouth with a linen napkin, and smiled warmly at both of them. I told Vanessa she made an excellent point about the critical importance of matching financial portfolios. The sheer irony of her statement was almost too delicious to endure. She was wearing stolen money advocating for a man who was technically destitute while trying to insult a woman who had $8 million legally walled off in an impenetrable offshore trust. Throughout the grueling dinner, I kept my eyes focused on the subtle glow of Carter's smartphone resting on the edge of the table. He was so busy boasting about his real estate syndicate that he was completely ignoring the flashing push notifications from his financial news applications. I knew exactly what those alerts were detailing. I had spent the entire afternoon monitoring the Federal Reserve broadcasts from my home office. The national economic landscape was currently undergoing a massive violent shift. Inflation reports had just come in significantly hotter than anyone on Wall Street had projected. The central bank was actively preparing to announce an emergency, unprecedented interest rate hike to cool the boiling economy. Carter flagged down the waiter and demanded the check with a theatrical sweeping flourish. When the heavy leather billfold arrived, he pulled out his premium metal credit card and tossed it onto the table, complaining one last time about how expensive it was to support a freeloader for the night. I watched the waiter walk away with the card, knowing full well that Carter was charging a $1,000 dinner to an account that was teetering dangerously close to its absolute limit. He leaned back against the leather booth, rubbing his stomach, completely oblivious to the macroeconomic tidal wave that was currently forming directly over his head. The cheap, accessible debt that his entire syndicate relied upon was about to vanish overnight. The commercial properties he was bragging about were about to plummet in value as borrowing costs skyrocketed. I picked up my wine glass, taking a final, satisfying sip of the vintage Bordeaux he was paying for, perfectly content to sit in absolute silence and wait for the financial markets to open on Monday morning. 1,000 words. Monday morning arrived with the subtle, quiet intensity of a bomb counting down its final seconds. I woke up early, brewed a pot of the cheap coffee Carter insisted I drink, and sat at the kitchen island with my laptop. At precisely 8:30 in the morning, the financial news networks interrupted their regular broadcasting. The Federal Reserve, reacting to inflation numbers that had spiked far beyond their worst-case scenarios, announced an emergency aggressive interest rate hike. It was not a standard quarter-point adjustment. It was a massive, unprecedented leap designed to immediately shock the economy and halt the rapid expansion of cheap debt. Carter stumbled down the stairs a few minutes later, still wearing his expensive silk pajamas, rubbing his temples to soothe the lingering hangover from his $1,000 steakhouse dinner. He poured himself a glass of ice water and casually flipped open his tablet to check his sports scores. He was entirely relaxed, believing his commercial real estate deal was safely insulated from any macroeconomic shifts. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, taking a slow sip of my coffee. It took exactly 4 minutes for the reality of the situation to reach his inbox. His tablet pinged with a high-priority email notification. Then his smartphone chimed. Then his smartwatch vibrated frantically against his wrist. The notifications began cascading in a relentless, overlapping wave of digital panic. I watched the blood completely drain from Carter's face. His smug, relaxed posture vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrified stiffness. The commercial real estate market was the first domino to fall. Projects like Carter's syndicate relied exclusively on floating rate debt and the ability to refinance quickly. With the stroke of a pen at the Federal Reserve, the borrowing costs for his retail complex project effectively doubled overnight. The numbers no longer made sense. The profitability models his elite country club friends had pitched him were now completely worthless. Carter scrambled to dial the lead partner of the real estate syndicate, his fingers shaking so badly he dropped his phone on the marble countertop. He snatched it up, put it on speakerphone, and paced the length of the kitchen. The call connected, but the voice on the other end was not the jovial, arrogant investor from last week. It was a cold, panicked man frantically trying to stop his own bleeding. The partner informed Carter that the institutional backers had triggered their material adverse change clauses and pulled their funding entirely. The acquisition was dead. The project was officially terminated. Carter shouted into the phone, demanding to know what was going to happen to his initial capital injection, the massive sum he had borrowed against his house and his stock portfolio. The partner delivered the crushing blow. The earnest money deposits and early-stage development costs were non-refundable. The syndicate was dissolving, and every single unaccredited investor who had bought in on the bottom tier was going to take a total unrecoverable loss. Carter was holding an empty bag. He hung up the phone and stared at the blank screen, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He looked at me sitting quietly at the kitchen island and opened his mouth to speak. But before he could form a single word, his phone rang again. This time it was not a real estate developer. It was his primary stockbroker. The stock market had reacted violently to the interest rate hike. Equities were plunging across the board, wiping out trillions of dollars in market capitalization within the first 2 hours of trading. Because Carter had arrogantly borrowed heavily on margin to fund his real estate gamble, he had used his entire stock portfolio as collateral. Now that the value of his stocks was plummeting, he no longer met the minimum equity requirements to maintain his massive loan. The broker's voice was devoid of emotion as he delivered the fatal strike. It was a margin call. Carter was required to deposit an astronomical amount of liquid cash into his account by the end of the trading day to cover the deficit. If he failed to produce the cash, the brokerage would legally force the liquidation of his entire portfolio at rock-bottom market prices to cover their risk. Carter begged. He paced the kitchen floor, his voice cracking as he pleaded with the broker for a 48-hour extension, claiming he had incoming capital from his software sales commissions. The broker flatly refused. Margin calls in a crashing market do not afford grace periods. Carter had absolutely zero liquid cash to deposit because he had dumped every single available cent into the failed real estate syndicate and his lavish Dubai vacation. He was trapped. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the automated liquidation protocols triggered. Carter sat paralyzed at the kitchen table, watching his computer screen as his entire life savings, his retirement accounts, and his aggressive growth portfolios were systematically sold off at a massive loss. His net worth evaporated into thin air. He had essentially set his own financial house on fire and locked the doors from the inside. The immediate cash crunch hit him like a freight train. Within a matter of days, the bills for his debt-fueled lifestyle began arriving, demanding payments he could no longer make. He spent his evenings frantically transferring tiny amounts of money between his remaining checking accounts, trying to keep up the appearance of solvency. He completely stopped mentioning his 50-50 rule, avoiding eye contact with me whenever I walked through the room. The arrogant, boastful man who had toasted to my financial ruin at our backyard barbecue was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell. The ultimate physical manifestation of his collapse occurred precisely 2 weeks later in the dead of night. It was a Tuesday at 3 in the morning. I was asleep in the guest bedroom, having moved out of the master suite the day he demanded rent. A low, heavy mechanical rumble outside the house woke me. I quietly slipped out of bed, walked to the window, and peeked through the blinds. A heavy-duty unmarked tow truck had backed silently into our driveway. 2 men in dark uniforms were quickly and efficiently securing a series of metal chains to the axles of the shark blue Porsche. Carter had missed a single astronomical monthly payment, but luxury auto lenders do not waste time when economic indicators turn negative. They act swiftly to recover their depreciating assets before the borrower can hide them. I heard the frantic pounding of bare feet sprinting down the hallway. Carter burst out the front door wearing only his sweatpants, screaming into the freezing night air. He sprinted down the driveway, waving his arms desperately, begging the repo men to stop the winch. He swore he had a wire transfer pending, pleading with them not to take his car, completely abandoning any shred of his carefully crafted dignity. The men ignored him. They hoisted the sports car onto the flatbed, secured the hydraulic lift, and drove away, leaving Carter standing barefoot on the cold concrete. He dropped to his knees, right in the middle of the empty driveway, burying his face in his hands. The neighborhood was perfectly quiet, but the silence was deafening. His elite status symbol was gone. His investments were completely wiped out. His cash flow was non-existent. Panic set in completely as his debt-fueled lifestyle imploded in the dark, and I stood quietly at the window watching the absolute destruction of a man who had brought it entirely upon himself. The morning after the tow truck disappeared down our quiet suburban street, the house was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. Carter did not come back upstairs to bed. When I finally walked down to the kitchen at dawn, I found him asleep on the living room sofa, still wearing his sweatpants, shivering without a blanket. He looked entirely pathetic, stripped of the glossy armor he had worn for the past 5 years. When he woke up, he did not mention the missing sports car. He showered, put on an older, slightly faded suit from the back of his closet, and ordered a standard rideshare to take him to the office. He walked out the front door with his shoulders hunched, completely unaware that his desperate scramble for cash was about to cross a fatal, unforgivable line. Carter was a man drowning in a rapid current of high-interest debt, and his immediate instinct was to grab onto anything that floated regardless of the consequences. His commercial real estate syndicate was dead, his stock portfolio was liquidated, and his credit cards were completely maxed out. Yet the bills for the Dubai trip, the country club memberships, and the second mortgage were aggressively demanding payment. He needed thousands of dollars in liquid cash instantly, just to maintain the illusion of solvency to his elite peers. Driven by absolute panic and a dangerous level of unearned arrogance, he turned to the only well of capital he still had access to: his corporate expense account at the software company. Carter firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. He assumed the corporate finance department was run by bureaucratic drones who would never question the expenditures of a top-producing sales director. He began his scheme with small creative adjustments. He fabricated receipts for lavish client dinners at five-star steakhouses, submitting reimbursement requests for $1,000 meals that never actually happened. When those initial requests were approved and the cash hit his checking account, the adrenaline rush of stolen money temporarily masked his deep financial terror. He grew bolder and significantly more reckless. He started inventing elaborate regional sales retreats, generating fake invoices from imaginary event vendors and catering services. He funneled the reimbursed corporate funds directly into his personal checking account, immediately turning around to pay the minimum balances on his drowning credit lines. He genuinely thought he was outsmarting a multi-million-dollar software enterprise. He believed his status as a sales rainmaker made him completely untouchable, convinced that even if someone noticed a slight discrepancy, they would look the other way to keep their star director happy. He wildly underestimated the efficiency of modern corporate auditing software. His company did not rely on tired accountants manually reviewing paper receipts. They utilized an aggressive automated artificial intelligence tracking system designed specifically to flag irregular spending patterns. Carter's sudden massive spike in undocumented client entertainment and phantom vendor invoices triggered a massive red alert in the system within a matter of days. The finance team did not just notice. They quietly initiated a full comprehensive forensic audit of his entire departmental budget. They built a meticulous, undeniable case against him over the course of 72 hours. They contacted the restaurants on his receipts and verified that no such reservations existed. They traced the routing numbers on the vendor invoices directly back to his personal banking portfolio. They wrapped a suffocating legal net around him while he was sitting in his corner office completely oblivious, still trying to figure out how to hide the fact that his car had been repossessed. The trap snapped shut on a Thursday morning. Carter was summoned to the Human Resources Department on the top floor of the corporate headquarters. He grabbed his tablet and swaggered into the executive suite, expecting to discuss his quarterly performance metrics or negotiate a higher commission tier. Instead, he walked into a completely sterile room occupied by the chief financial officer, the head of human resources, and the company's lead corporate litigator. They did not offer him a seat. They did not exchange pleasantries. The lead litigator simply slid a thick-bound folder across the glass table. It contained every single fabricated receipt, every forged invoice, and a complete trace of the embezzled corporate funds. Carter's arrogant smirk melted off his face. The air vanished from his lungs. He tried to stammer out an excuse, attempting to deploy his famous sales charm to spin the blatant theft as a creative accounting error. The CFO cut him off immediately, his voice completely devoid of empathy. The terms of his execution were brutal and absolute. He was terminated effectively immediately for gross misconduct and corporate theft. The golden handcuffs he had always bragged about, his massive trove of unvested stock options and deferred compensation, were entirely revoked. They were wiped out in an instant. The litigator then delivered the final crushing blow. The company had enough hard evidence to hand him over to federal authorities for felony embezzlement, which carried a mandatory prison sentence. However, they offered him a singular, humiliating alternative to protect their public optics. He was forced to sign a strict ironclad separation agreement and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. He had to surrender his final commission checks and his accrued paid time off to cover the exact amount of the stolen funds. He would walk out of the building with absolutely zero severance pay, stripped of his title, his income, and his professional reputation. Terrified of the prospect of wearing a prison uniform, Carter grabbed the pen with violently shaking hands and signed away his career. He was escorted back to his desk by two armed corporate security guards. He was given exactly 10 minutes to pack his personal belongings into a standard brown cardboard box, while his junior sales representatives watched in stunned silence. They confiscated his corporate phone, his laptop, and his building access badge. He was marched out of the glass revolving doors and left standing on the downtown sidewalk in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, holding a cardboard box of cheap desk ornaments, completely stripped of his identity. I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing supply chain logistics for Lumina Ergo when the front door slowly creaked open. It was barely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Carter shuffled into the foyer. His tie was loosened, his collar was unbuttoned, and his custom suit looked suddenly ill-fitting on his deflated frame. He dropped the brown cardboard box onto the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a judge's gavel. He did not say a word. He did not offer an arrogant demand or a condescending insult. He walked past the kitchen, his eyes glassy and vacant, a man whose entire financial lifeblood had just been instantly and permanently vaporized. He slowly climbed the stairs, looking like a ghost, haunting his own hallway, while I calmly returned my focus to my screen, knowing the final fatal blow of his precious 50-50 rule was rapidly approaching. 1,000 words. For weeks following his humiliating termination, Carter transformed into a ghost, haunting the second floor of our home. He did not look for another job. He did not reach out to his once prized professional network. The man who had previously thrived on aggressive posturing and dominant displays of wealth completely shut down. He spent his days locked in the master bedroom, leaving only to retrieve bottles of cheap liquor from the pantry. He traded his custom-tailored suits for unwashed sweatpants, letting his beard grow out into a ragged, unkempt mess. The silence in the house was heavy, punctuated only by the relentless daily ringing of his mobile phone. Debt collectors from the credit card companies he had maxed out in Dubai were aggressively pursuing him, their automated calls acting as a constant metronome of his financial decay. I maintained my routine with absolute discipline. On the first of every month, I wrote my small, precise check for my half of the market rate rent and left it on the kitchen counter. Before his termination, Carter would have snatched that check with a smug grin, using it to validate his power over me. Now he crept downstairs in the middle of the night to claim it, desperately depositing my modest contribution just to cover his basic living expenses and alcohol. He never once asked how I was paying it, and he certainly never offered to return to a joint financial system. His pride, though severely battered, still refused to admit defeat to the woman he had publicly labeled a freeloader. He chose absolute denial over action. The physical mail began to pile up, creating a mounting mountain of past due notices, final warnings, and certified bank letters on the entryway console. Carter refused to open a single one. Whenever a thick, official-looking envelope arrived bearing the logo of the bank that held his primary and secondary mortgages, he simply tossed it unopened into the bottom of the hallway garbage can. He operated under the delusional assumption that if he ignored the problem long enough, the financial institutions would somehow forget about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had recklessly borrowed for his failed commercial real estate syndicate. But banks do not forget, and high-interest debt does not simply evaporate. The months dragged on, the seasons shifting outside our windows while the temperature inside the house remained bitterly cold due to his inability to pay the heating bill. Carter was drowning and the water was rapidly rising above his head. He had missed 4 consecutive mortgage payments. The second mortgage, the one he had leveraged to the absolute hilt, was entirely in default. He had 0 income, 0 liquid assets, and 0 prospects. The inevitable reckoning arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing quarterly tax strategies for Lumina Ergo, with my laptop screen angled away from the foyer. A loud, sharp, aggressive pounding echoed from the front porch. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was the forceful, demanding strike of a legal courier. Carter stumbled out of the living room looking disheveled and frantic. He froze at the base of the stairs, staring at the heavy oak door as the pounding resumed. He slowly walked forward, his hands trembling as he unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. There was no one on the porch. The courier had already walked away, leaving behind a thick, bright yellow document securely taped at eye level directly to the wood of our front door. Carter ripped the tape off, tearing the paper in his haste. He slammed the door shut and leaned his back against it, sliding down slightly as he began to read. I closed my laptop quietly, giving him my full attention. The document was a formal notice of foreclosure and intent to evict. I watched his eyes dart violently back and forth across the dense legal text. His breathing hitched, accelerating into short, shallow, panicked gasps. The paper shook wildly in his hands. He read the paragraphs aloud in a fractured, frantic whisper, trying to make sense of the devastating legal reality collapsing around him. The notice stated that his original lending institution had grown tired of his continuous defaults. They had aggressively moved to clear their books of his toxic debt. Rather than dragging out a lengthy internal foreclosure process, the bank had bundled his distressed mortgages and sold them off at a steep discount to a private equity firm. The name of the acquiring firm was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink right in the center of the page. Apex Holdings, LLC. This mysterious private equity firm was not interested in offering grace periods or negotiating a restructuring plan. They were ruthless. The document outlined a brutal, immediate demand. Because the debt had been transferred under a strict distressed asset buyout clause, Apex Holdings LLC required an immediate lump sum repayment of the entire outstanding mortgage balance. Carter did not have $100 to his name, let alone hundreds of thousands. If the balance was not paid in full by certified cashier's check within 24 hours, the notice stipulated that Apex Holdings LLC would initiate a rapid, non-negotiable 30-day eviction process. The property would be seized, the locks would be changed, and Carter would be legally barred from entering the premises. The paper slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the hardwood floor. Carter sank completely to the ground, pulling his knees to his chest. He was hyperventilating, dragging thin, useless breaths into his tightening lungs. The man who had once stood on our backyard deck and arrogantly demanded I pay my own way was now curled into a ball in the hallway, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his financial annihilation. I sat perfectly still on my stool, watching him gasp for air. I did not rush over to comfort him. I did not offer him a glass of water. I simply stared at the yellow paper resting on the floor near his bare feet. Apex Holdings, LLC. The name looked incredibly official, harsh, and unforgiving. It sounded exactly like the type of faceless corporate machine that devours overleveraged men who try to play games entirely outside their intellectual weight class. He gripped the fabric of his sweatpants, rocking back and forth as the reality of his impending eviction crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. The walls of the suburban house he had used to exert his dominance were now rapidly closing in on him. He was completely out of options, out of money, and out of time. The sheer desperation radiating from him was palpable, a suffocating aura of defeat that filled the entire foyer. He was staring down the barrel of immediate homelessness, and the terror in his eyes was absolute. He had no idea what to do next, leaving him perfectly primed for the desperate, pathetic demands he was about to hurl in my direction. 1,000 words. Carter walked out of the kitchen with hollow, unsteady steps, the brutal reality of his impending eviction settling over him like a suffocating, heavy shroud. The house he proudly claimed as his sole dominion felt like an empty tomb. He climbed the steep stairs to his home office, his breathing shallow and erratic. Glossy brochures for luxury watches and country clubs littered his desk, looking like mocking relics of a dead civilization. He sank into his leather executive chair, his hands shaking violently as he picked up his smartphone. He had one final lifeline remaining. He had blood. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped his sister's contact name. Vanessa had always been his biggest cheerleader, his faithful companion on the lavish Dubai trip, and the loudest voice validating his superiority. He firmly believed that since he funded her lavish lifestyle and showered her with expensive gifts, when he was flush with cash, she would naturally rush to his rescue in his darkest hour. Family helps family in times of crisis. It was the exact toxic rhetoric he had just tried to weaponize against me, but this time he genuinely believed it would save him from absolute ruin. The phone rang 3 times before Vanessa answered. Loud, pulsing dance music and the clinking of glasses echoed in the background. She was clearly at a trendy downtown lounge sipping overpriced cocktails funded by the last remnants of credit he had likely co-signed. She answered with a breezy, careless greeting, completely oblivious to the sheer terror radiating from her brother. Carter did not bother with pleasantries. He launched into a frantic, disjointed explanation of his catastrophic ruin. He told her about the corporate embezzlement termination, the massive margin call, and the aggressive foreclosure notice from Apex Holdings, LLC. He stripped away every ounce of his manufactured pride, his voice cracking as he begged his sister for a loan. He pleaded for just enough liquid cash to hire a defense attorney or stall the private equity firm. When she remained silent, he lowered his expectations, begging her just to let him crash on her sofa for a few weeks until he could figure out a survival strategy. The loud music in the background of Vanessa's call suddenly became muffled as she stepped outside the busy lounge. The silence that followed was heavy and thick with tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of the sycophantic warmth she always used when he was handing her his premium credit card. It was cold, sharp, and dripping with absolute disgust. She asked him to repeat himself, demanding to know if he was truly completely broke. Carter choked on a dry sob, admitting that his accounts were empty, and he was facing immediate street homelessness. He reminded her of the designer bags, the luxury hotel suites, and the first-class flights he had freely provided. He invoked their shared last name, pleading for sisterly loyalty. Vanessa let out a harsh, vicious laugh that cut straight through his desperation. She did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, she unleashed a torrent of venomous ridicule. She told him he was a pathetic failure who had humiliated their entire family. She berated him for losing his high-paying job over a stupid amateurish accounting scam. She reminded him that he was supposed to be the commercial real estate mastermind, the multimillionaire who was going to elevate their social standing. Finding out he was actually a destitute fraud filled her with intense, unforgiving embarrassment and anger. Carter gripped the edge of his heavy desk, his knuckles turning white as he listened to his own flesh and blood verbally eviscerate him. He begged her to stop reminding her that she had happily spent the very money that led to his ruin. Vanessa immediately rejected any responsibility. She coldly informed him that a real man would have managed his finances better. She stated that her luxury apartment had no room for a disgraced, unemployed squatter. She explicitly told him that she had a reputation to maintain in the city and could not associate with a failure. She declared she could absolutely not be seen associating with a brother who was about to be forcibly evicted by a private equity firm. He cried into the receiver, a guttural, pathetic sound of absolute defeat. He begged for just a few $100s to get a cheap motel room. Vanessa delivered her final, devastating blow. She told him to go ask his freeloader wife for an allowance, explicitly mocking the exact financial dynamic Carter had so proudly boasted about creating just months prior. She stated she was done dealing with losers and told him never to call again. The line went dead. The abrupt click echoed in Carter's ear. He pulled the phone away from his face, staring at the glowing screen in pure disbelief. His hands trembled as he immediately hit redial, desperate to convince himself it was just a bad connection or a momentary loss of temper. The automated carrier voice responded instantly, informing him the number was permanently unavailable. Vanessa had blocked him. She had severed their relationship in less than 10 seconds, discarding him the absolute minute the free money train derailed. Carter threw his smartphone across the office in a blind rage. It smashed into the drywall, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of useless glass before dropping to the floor. The betrayal by his sister broke the final fragile load-bearing pillar of his sanity. The illusion of his elite status, his supreme intelligence, and his loyal family had all been completely incinerated. He sank to the floor of his office, surrounded by the shadows of a house he no longer owned, his breathing ragged and wild. The total psychological collapse stripped away his remaining logic, leaving only a dangerous desperation as he prepared for one final irrational confrontation. The silence of the house was violently shattered by the sound of Carter stomping down the wooden staircase. His heavy, erratic footsteps signaled the complete psychological unraveling of a man who had just run out of road. I was standing in the kitchen, casually wiping down the marble countertops, when his voice boomed through the foyer. He bellowed my name, a raw, aggressive sound demanding my immediate presence in the living room. There was no request in his tone, only the frantic, cornered entitlement of a predator caught in a trap. I calmly folded the microfiber cloth, placed it next to the sink, and walked into the cavernous living space fully prepared for the final, desperate escalation. Carter was pacing like a caged animal across the expensive area rug. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, his posture stripped of the polished corporate swagger he had weaponized against me for years. He spun around the moment I entered the room, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. He completely discarded his previous post-nuptial arrogance and his strict 50-50 financial doctrine. He launched into a manic, threatening tirade, declaring that since we were still legally married, he possessed an absolute, undeniable marital right to every single dollar I had hidden away. He threatened to hire the most ruthless, aggressive divorce attorney in Denver the moment the sun came up. He claimed his lawyer would secure a court order to brutally audit my freelance design business, subpoena my bank accounts, and freeze whatever meager savings I had accumulated. He shouted that a wife's income generated during the marriage was legally considered joint property, totally rewriting his own history and ignoring the financial barriers he had ruthlessly enforced. He demanded that I voluntarily liquidate my assets right then and there to pay off Apex Holdings and stall the impending foreclosure. He swore that if I forced him to drag me into family court, he would ensure I was left entirely penniless, promising to seize half of my money to save his precious house and destroy my life in the process. I stood near the edge of the room, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my expression entirely blank. His desperation was utterly pathetic. He genuinely believed that threatening a messy, hostile divorce would terrify me into submission. He thought the prospect of legal discovery would force me to hand over my cash to rescue his shattered ego. I did not argue with his delusions. I did not point out the staggering hypocrisy of a man who had previously mocked my income, now threatening legal warfare to steal it. I simply watched him hyperventilate, letting his empty threats echo off the high ceilings. Right as Carter reached the chaotic crescendo of his threatening monologue, screaming about how the legal system would force me to submit to his financial rescue plan, a sharp, crisp chime echoed through the foyer. The doorbell rang with impeccable, almost cinematic timing. Carter abruptly stopped shouting, his chest heaving as he stared at the heavy oak door in sheer confusion. He had no friends left to visit him, and bill collectors rarely knocked after dark. I walked right past his trembling, outstretched arm, ignoring his sputtering demands to know who was outside. I grasped the brass handle and pulled the door open, allowing the cool evening air to sweep into the stifling tension of the house. Nia stood on the front porch looking like a flawless legal executioner. She was dressed in an immaculate, razor-sharp charcoal pinstripe suit, her posture radiating absolute, unwavering authority. She held a sleek black leather briefcase in one hand, completely unfazed by the hostile atmosphere radiating from the foyer. She stepped inside the house without waiting for a formal invitation, her expensive heels clicking authoritatively against the hardwood floor. Carter spun around his face, turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. He immediately recognized my sister-in-law, but his bruised ego absolutely refused to acknowledge her professional capacity. He aggressively stepped forward, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate her. He pointed his finger toward the open doorway, loudly demanding that she turn around and leave his property immediately. He shouted that this was a private, highly sensitive marital dispute, and he would absolutely not tolerate my extended family interfering in his household affairs. His voice cracked as he threatened to call the police and have her forcibly removed for trespassing if she did not step back out onto the porch. Nia did not flinch. She did not raise her voice, and she did not break eye contact. She simply walked right past his trembling finger, navigating the living room, with the calm ownership of someone who held all the cards. She walked over to the premium leather sofa Carter could no longer afford and took a seat right in the center of it. She set her black briefcase onto the glass coffee table with a heavy, definitive thud that commanded the entire room. She looked up at Carter with eyes that held absolutely zero sympathy, zero hesitation, and zero fear. Nia calmly informed Carter that she was not sitting in his living room acting in the capacity of a concerned family member. She stated with chilling precision that she was present exclusively as my retained corporate and asset protection counsel. Carter stood frozen, the threat of police intervention dying instantly in his throat as the reality of her words struck him. Nia smoothly popped the polished silver latches on her briefcase. The sharp metallic snaps cut through the tense silence of the room. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of legally binding documents, sliding them precisely onto the center of the glass table. She folded her hands over the paperwork and instructed him to sit down and listen very carefully. She told him that the hostile financial war he had just threatened to initiate had actually been fought months ago, and he had completely lost the battle before he even realized he was playing the game. Carter slowly lowered himself into the armchair opposite the sofa, his defiance cracking into bewildered apprehension. Nia slid the familiar blue folder across the smooth glass surface. Carter recognized it instantly. It was the exact post-nuptial agreement he had aggressively forced me to sign under the explicit threat of immediate homelessness. Nia opened the folder with clinical precision, tapping her expensive fountain pen against the very clauses Carter had demanded his overpriced attorney draft to protect his imaginary commercial real estate fortune. She read his own weaponized legal terminology aloud, her voice ringing with clear, unquestionable authority. She highlighted the specific paragraph stating that any corporate entity's intellectual property and future liquidity events belong 100% to the individual creator, completely waiving any and all marital rights to asset division or spousal support in perpetuity. Carter scoffed, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, attempting to regain his rapidly deteriorating footing. He aggressively stated that he knew exactly what the contract said because he paid an exorbitant fee for it, boasting that it ensured I could not touch whatever money he managed to salvage from his current financial crisis. Nia smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile that commanded the entire room. She calmly informed him that the document did not protect his assets at all because he currently possessed absolutely zero assets to protect. Instead, she explained he had successfully and permanently barricaded himself away from a multi-million-dollar fortune. Nia reached into her sleek briefcase and withdrew a secondary stack of heavy watermarked financial documents. She spread them out meticulously on the glass table right next to the post-nuptial agreement. They were the official valuation reports, corporate tax returns, and recent distribution contracts for Lumina Ergo. Carter leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as he read the $8 million enterprise valuation printed in bold black ink. Nia broke down the numbers with brutal, undeniable clarity. She detailed the massive supply chain expansions, the seven-figure cash reserves, and the soaring profit margins I had built entirely under his nose. She explained that while he was busy itemizing grocery bills on his phone and demanding market-rate rent, I was successfully operating a highly lucrative e-commerce empire from the cramped corner of the guest bedroom. Carter stared at the paperwork, his eyes darting frantically across the overwhelming figures. The cognitive dissonance was total and paralyzing. He tried to process the fact that the woman he constantly degraded as a freeloader was actually a self-made millionaire. He realized with sickening clarity that by enforcing his strict 50-50 financial split and demanding the post-nuptial agreement, he had voluntarily handed over any legal claim he might have ever had to a massive fortune. His breathing became shallow and erratic. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation drained the remaining color from his face. He opened his mouth to argue, perhaps to claim fraud or marital deception, but Nia immediately cut him off. She sharply reminded him that he had mandated the absolute separation of finances without demanding any prior asset disclosure, ensuring he dug his own financial grave and jumped in willingly. Stripped of his financial power and completely legally outmaneuvered, Carter scrambled to find a single shred of dominance to cling to. His ego, battered and bleeding, latched onto the only physical asset he believed he still commanded. He abruptly stood up, his hands shaking with a toxic mixture of intense humiliation and desperate rage. He looked down at me, his lip curling into a vicious, defensive sneer. He declared that he did not care about my secret little furniture company or my hidden bank accounts. He shouted that his name was still on the deed to this property. He angrily reminded me that even though he was facing an aggressive foreclosure, he still had undeniable legal tenant rights in the state of Colorado. He boasted that Apex Holdings LLC must follow the mandatory 30-day eviction process. He told me to pack my bags and get out of his house immediately, loudly declaring that he was going to spend his final 30 days living in peace without my parasitic presence dragging him down. I remained seated on the sofa next to Nia, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. I did not raise my voice, and I did not react to his desperate hostility. I simply opened the black leather portfolio resting on my lap. I pulled out a single heavy piece of paper bearing an official state certification stamp. I leaned forward and slid the document slowly across the glass coffee table, stopping it right in front of his trembling hands. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and told him to read the name of the sole managing member and chief executive officer of the private equity firm that had just purchased his distressed debt. Carter looked down at the paper. His eyes scanned the bold, authoritative text identifying the corporate structure of Apex Holdings, LLC. He saw my full legal name printed clearly on the executive officer line. The silence in the living room became absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. I watched his mind completely fracture as the reality set in. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I informed him, my voice ringing with cool, undeniable authority, that I took the cash from my hidden empire, contacted his increasingly desperate lenders, and purchased his toxic second mortgage for pennies on the dollar, entirely in cash. I explained that Apex Holdings, LLC, was not a faceless corporate machine. It was my personal holding company. I was the sole owner. I held his debt. I owned the house. Carter stared at the corporate registration resting on the glass table. His brain completely failed to process the catastrophic reality right in front of his eyes. He opened his mouth and stammered out fractured syllables, desperately looking toward Nia for some kind of legal loophole, a technicality that would save him from this ultimate humiliation. Nia simply offered him a cold and unwavering gaze. She opened her briefcase one final time and slid the distressed debt buyout agreement directly on top of the limited liability company registration. She calmly informed him that because he had severely violated the specific operational covenants of his commercial margin loans and defaulted across multiple institutional lines of credit, the standard eviction timelines were completely nullified. Apex Holdings, which was entirely under my absolute control, was legally executing an accelerated demand clause. I stepped closer to the table and looked down at the man who had spent 6 years trying to crush my spirit. I told him in a voice devoid of any sympathy that his 30-day grace period was a delusion. He had exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. The sheer finality of the 24-hour deadline shattered whatever pathetic remnants of pride he still possessed. He did not yell. He did not threaten to call his lawyers, because he knew he could not afford a single billable minute. He simply collapsed back into the armchair and buried his face in his hands, defeated by the very financial mechanisms he had tried to weaponize against me. I turned to Nia, thanked her for her flawless execution, and walked upstairs to get a full and uninterrupted night of sleep in the guest bedroom, leaving him alone in the dark with his monumental failure. The next morning was a masterclass in poetic justice. I stood by the kitchen island sipping a fresh cup of coffee and watched the spectacular and pathetic exodus of Carter. His luxury designer luggage had been sold or seized weeks ago during his desperate scramble for cash. Left with absolutely no other options, he was forced to pack the remaining fragments of his wardrobe into heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. He dragged them heavily down the stairs, the cheap plastic tearing against the wooden steps and spilling a few dress socks onto the landing. He looked completely hollowed out. The arrogant software director who had loudly demanded I pay market rate rent was now hauling garbage bags full of wrinkled suits out the front door. He did not look at me. He did not say goodbye. He loaded the bags into a cheap rideshare vehicle he could barely afford, closed the door, and drove away from the house he had once used as a financial prison. The moment the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared from sight, a profound and undeniable sense of absolute liberation washed over me. The air in the house instantly felt lighter and cleaner, completely purged of his toxic and suffocating ego. Later that afternoon, Naya seamlessly finalized the deed transfer, officially placing the property entirely under the protection of my corporate entity. To celebrate the victory, my brother Liam arrived with Nia just as the sun was setting. Liam carried a bottle of vintage champagne, the exact kind Carter used to pretend he could afford. We popped the cork in the very living room where Carter had delivered his cruel 50-50 ultimatum, filling the space with genuine laughter and the sweet taste of absolute victory. We toasted to brilliant legal strategy, to unwavering patience, and to the permanent removal of dead weight. The following week, I initiated the ultimate physical transformation of the property. Carter had always maintained a dark and overly masculine office on the first floor. It used to be filled with expensive golf memorabilia, leather recliners, and a massive mahogany desk meant to project an aura of supreme executive power. I ordered a specialized crew to gut the room entirely. I tore down the dark paneling and brought in maximum natural light. I transformed his monument to unearned arrogance into a sleek, modern, brightly lit executive command center for Lumina Ergo. I installed my own premium ergonomic designs and set up a multi-monitor workstation where I could oversee the global logistics of my $8 million empire. I sat in my new office, looking out over the front lawn, completely autonomous and entirely in control of my own destiny. Financial abuse is rarely loud. It often starts with subtle controls disguised as practical arrangements or logical boundaries. It creeps into a relationship through weaponized incompetence, through a partner constantly shifting the goalposts of success, and through a systemic and relentless effort to make you feel completely dependent and entirely worthless. Narcissists rely on your silence. They bank on your panic. They expect you to shrink, to cry, and to beg when they threaten your stability. But there is a distinct and unparalleled power in absolute silence. There is a lethal brilliance in choosing not to react, in letting them believe they are the smartest person in the room, while you quietly and meticulously construct a fortress they cannot ever penetrate. When someone tells you exactly who they are and how little they value you, believe them instantly. Do not argue. Do not try to prove your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding you. Simply agree, nod your head, and use their own arrogant rules to orchestrate their absolute destruction. Let their greed blind them. Let their ego build the very cage that will eventually trap them. Because there is no satisfaction quite like watching a tyrant confidently turn the key in a lock, completely unaware that they are standing on the wrong side of the iron bars. I took back my life, my dignity, and my financial freedom by playing a game he never even knew had started. Now it is your turn to share. I want to hear your stories of resilience and strategic survival. Have you ever been pushed to the edge by a toxic partner, only to outsmart them and reclaim your absolute power? How did you turn their manipulation against them? Drop your experiences in the comments below. Let us build a community of strength, share our victories, and remind each other that the most successful revenge is always a life beautifully lived on your own terms. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of triumphant and spectacular karma. The profound lesson from Riley's journey is the undeniable power of financial independence and silent strategy. When faced with a controlling partner who weaponized money, she didn't engage in screaming matches or beg for basic respect. Instead, she channeled her energy into quietly building her own empire and securing her legal boundaries. Her story teaches us that we do not have to loudly prove our worth to those committed to tearing us down. True strength lies in self-reliance, maintaining your composure, and letting a manipulator's arrogance become their downfall. Never surrender your autonomy. Or share your thoughts on Riley's strategy in the comments below.